Dr. Thompson from our own Jeremy Barrier, who described some of his background and his scholarship and his teaching and his ministry. And certainly he is well prepared to help us understand some things about pastoral ministry, spiritual formation, and the letters of Paul. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Thompson.
Well, I've enjoyed getting acquainted with the school, and have spoken to several of you individually, and so that was a pleasure. And I, as an elder and a preacher, I have come to love 1 Thessalonians, a book that in freshman Bible you think 1 Thessalonians is about the second coming, and some of it is, but as I mentioned this morning, at the previous lecture, the second coming is the time when a fully formed, shaped church is going to be presented to Christ. So for 1 Thessalonians, Paul is the epitome of what I would call what missions is all about, because for Paul, it is not just getting people in. For him, it is forming and shaping people. I grew up, I think I'm fifth generation Churches of Christ as far as I know, and so on one side of my family, they've all been members of the Churches of Christ. And when we'd get together, family reunions, first question usually was, how's the church doing? We had gone in our different directions. It was always, how's the church doing? That's an interesting question, because what are the criteria for saying how a church is doing? And there are a lot of criteria, some are better than others, as to saying how a church is doing. I'll begin by talking about the structure of 1 Thessalonians as I talk about spiritual formation. Paul is a preacher, and one of the things I've learned in my recent interest in rhetoric is how intentional the rhetorician is in making his case. And 1 Thessalonians fits that so well that it's very intentional the way Paul goes. And one of the things I learned is that the ancient orator always puts his audience at ease and says something that is non-controversial and makes them readily and easily disposed. And then they give something of a history of the case, and then they make their case. So that's kind of the outline that I learned about what ancient orators were taught. And I think of 1 Thessalonians that way, because as you look at the first chapter is all, depending on the Bible you're using and how it does the paragraphing, it's all one statement. It's all a thanksgiving. So the proportion of 1 Thessalonians, that's prayer and thanksgiving, is pretty extraordinary. So verses 2 to 10 are really a part of a thanksgiving of what Paul wants to mention. And in terms of spiritual formation, you're going to see what is important for Paul. How is the church doing? Well, I thank God for your work of faith, your labor of love, your steadfastness of hope. So I want to say in this presentation, what is the mark of a good church? And here is Paul, who is saying that he is very thankful for their faith, their hope, and their love. That's what he wanted the church to be. We don't know the numbers. In fact, Paul never, ever mentioned numbers in all of his letters. He talks about formation. So as we walk through 1 Thessalonians, there's the Thanksgiving that introduces the topic. And the topic is faith, hope, and love. That's going to be coming back at you repeatedly in 1 Thessalonians. Chapter 2 basically talks about the time that Paul was with them. And so he's rehearsing the past relationship. That's always a good lead up to a presentation. What is our past relationship? And then chapter 3 is continuing to talk about their past relationship and how well they're doing. So we learned that Paul had been worried about the Thessalonians, and so he had sent Timothy to make sure that the recent events and the struggles that they were having would not shake them up, but they would be faithful. And then Timothy has come back and he has said very good things about their faith and their love. That theme just keeps coming back as he talks about their faith and their love. And then we have the prayer. As I mentioned in the first presentation, the prayer is the hinge of 1 Thessalonians, because here as he makes the transition from the past to the future. So the rest of 1 Thessalonians is about the future. So where does he want the church to go? That's the question. We had the prayer as to where he wants the church to go, that I said was the hinge of the book, that they will love each other more and more and love all more and more, and that they will be sanctified. That's where he wants the prayer to go. But how do you get them there? I think that's what 1 Thessalonians is going to tell us. How do you get from the beginning, when you turn to God from idols, and when you change from being enslaved to the flesh to being a new person? After you've made that transition, how do you get to the telos, the end? And that's what 1 Thessalonians is really about, and that is his prayer. So the good church is the good church of chapter 1 that has faith, hope, and love. Now, I'll say something about Paul as a missionary. I've always been struck by chapter 2, how chapter 2 is autobiographical. In fact, almost all of Paul's letters at the early part has an autobiographical section. Here is the person telling us a little bit about himself, which I think is good for preachers, to tell a little bit about themselves. But the thing that caught my eye, I did a book called Preaching Like Paul, and what really caught my eye, I got my theology of preaching actually from 1 Thessalonians. He has preached and they have received the gospel. And then chapter 2 talks about the spiritual formation of what the preacher does. And the first thing we notice is the character of the preacher. The character of the preacher, Aristotle said the most effective argument is the argument from ethos, the speaker's character. And so that's why you have Paul talking autobiographically so much. There is the character of the speaker. But notice the kinds of things that Paul did just after the conversion. He didn't stop there. And I really would like to know how long he was there, because he did a lot of things. But I call to your attention, chapter 2, verse 1, as you yourselves know, brothers, our visit to you was not in vain. But having suffered previously, been mistreated, as you know, we were bold to speak the word of God in Philippi, the gospel, in much pain and anguish. The Greek word is in much agony. Now, verse 3, for our exhortation was not our exhortation was not in deceit or in uncleanness nor in guile, as we were entrusted by God. And I will stop here and mention the fact that one discovery I made is the preaching of the gospel does not stop with conversion. That Paul kept on preaching the basic essentials to the gospel even after the church was formed. One of the most influential books I think, of the 20th century. Was by C.H. Dodd. Very, very small little book, but how influential that is. And the title of it is The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments. And he makes the case that preaching, when you preach the gospel, that's to the outsider, and teaching is for the church. And I think you couldn't be more wrong in describing that, because the people often have very short memories. And so you continue to preach the basic facts of the gospel after the conversion. And that's what Paul said he did. He talks about his paraklesis, his exhortation. And he kept going on preaching even after the conversion. So that's the shaping and the forming of a church. We see his character. And he talks about how he came not with deceit or guile, and besides that, he preached night and day. If you look at chapter 2, verse 9 and following, night and day, he said, didn't want to burden you down. We preach to you the gospel. Now that's to converts. He's preaching the gospel to converts. So he didn't quit telling the fundamentals of the faith once they were converted, night and day. And the other thing I notice is his statement of his character. I worked with my hands. And you might remember chapter 4, verse 11, when he gets to where he wants them to go, he says, work with your hands. In other words, spiritual formation needs models. And so what does he do? In order to form and shape people, he is a model of the kind of character he expects of them. He devoted himself, he gave himself to the gospel. That is self-denial that he gave them. And so he is the model for what he is going to ask of them in chapters 4 and 5. So part of formation is to have someone who is a model of the faith, and he can continue to do the pastoral work there. There are some other verses here that tell you something about what Paul did for new converts to shape and form them. I mentioned chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. I mentioned that. What did he do? He worked night and day. He didn't want to burden anyone. Well, obviously that's a model for what he wanted of them. He denied them himself. Then he says in verse 7, and your translations will vary about what he says, but traditional translations say, we were gentle among you like a nurse, actually a wet nurse, taking care of her children. Now, there's some manuscript differences there as to whether he says gentle or whether he says babe. And it's only one letter difference on that. But most translations say we were gentle among you like a nurse. That is shaping and forming the people. He's taking on a kind of maternal instinct in taking care of them. And then the next thing in forming them, he's like a father. If you look at chapter 2, verse 12, I was like a father among you. And he has three participles, three verbs here, telling what he wanted them to do. I was urging you, I was pleading with you to do what? To lead a life worthy of the gospel or worthy of God. Like a father. Okay, shaping the church means telling people how to behave. You have pagans who have come in with no idea of what the Christian faith is all about or what the habits that are expected of them. That happens all the time today. In a kind of pagan society, you make converts and they have no idea what's expected of them. But here he spent time. I wonder how much time he spent telling them to lead a life worthy of God. So formation is moral formation. That's what, to be a moral people, and he's going to explain that in chapters 4 and 5, to be a moral people. There's something else he did in shaping and forming a people, which I think is necessary. He took these people from different backgrounds, and to give cohesion for this church that can be formed and be shaped, he imparts to them a story. You know, any kind of community needs a corporate story. What it unites us is a story. In schools, we teach American history. Even immigrants have to come in and say, this is our story. Well, he makes them a part of Israel. One of the almost humorous comments he makes when he talks about sexual ethics in chapter 4 is, take a wife in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles. Well, they are Gentiles. But he has incorporated them into Israel's story, and he's given them a story. He's also given them, I like to say Christians have a little bit of their own dialect. There's a new kind of vocabulary that unites them together. Now, some words were ordinary Greek words, but they had a new meaning. The word church, ecclesia. Well, that was a common Greek word, but now it has a new meaning. It's a part of Israel's story of the people of God. Chapter 1, verse 4 or 5, he talks about their election. Well, that's biblical terminology that he gives them. Or he talks about sanctification. All these are new vocabulary. When I think of that, I think of immigrants coming here and watching a football game or a tennis match or whatever. There's always a kind of strange vocabulary. I'll use tennis as an example. It's 40 love. Well, what does that mean? That's just the vocabulary of tennis. Well, there's a new vocabulary that he gives them. There's a vocabulary of baseball and football that you have to be enculturated into to understand the vocabulary. Churches of Christ have always had a very distinctive vocabulary, and I've kidded that nobody could ever fake coming into our fellowship and fake it that he was one of us. How much is that true? You couldn't come in and fake it. Whatever other group would talk about placing membership. Boy, I was learned when I was a kid, you don't join the church. Boy, that would give you away in a second. So we could have fun talking about the kind of distinctive vocabulary, but that's a part of being a cohesive group, to have its own speech. Again, you take these people together from all different backgrounds, and how do you make a community out of that? Do you know what the most dominant metaphor, I ask my students this, the most dominant metaphor for the church in the New Testament? And it always surprises them. Somebody will say body of Christ, or it'll always surprise me. You know what the most dominant metaphor in the New Testament for church? It's family. The term is not used, but 1 Thessalonians, I haven't done the count, but somebody else has. 1 Thessalonians has more references to siblings, adelphos, adelphoi, brothers, NRSV, brothers and sisters, because this community does have men and women, more per page than any other New Testament book. That's called enculturating and giving them a sense of identity that they are a family. And you have to keep in mind, these are people who have been abandoned by their families So formation means to act like a family. So I think of one of the favorite expressions, not only Paul, but elsewhere, is the expression one another, bear one another's burdens, love one another. That's family language. In the ancient world, it's family took care of each other. And so the one another passages all have a kind of connotation of acting as family. So you're beginning to shape and form a community. And you do that by making them have a sense that they are family. So the author, Paul, says, encourage one another. Build each other up. 5:11. Seek the good of one another. Love one another. All of those one another passages have the connotation of this is how families treat each other. So there's a sense of, if you're going to be a community and you're made up of not people who have a biological relationship, then you need to have them have a common story, a common set of values, a common behavior, and a sense of family that made a difference. So Paul is very, very careful, if he's going to have that church that at the coming of Christ is shaped and formed, he's very intentional about finding a way to shape and form them. There's something else he does. You can check in your scripture, but one thing that really has struck me about reading 1 Thessalonians is the number of times he says, you know. He writes a letter to tell them what he's already told them. And a lot of formation is repetition. Tell them what you've already told them. And you'll see that as you go through, that repetition is a good thing. This is kind of a conversion experience I've had, because as a young preacher, I treasured originality. And so I would judge preachers on, I've never heard this before. And that was supposed to be good, that I've never heard it before. Well, I raised my family, and there are things that we thought everybody knew. But if you don't repeat it a few times, they don't know it. And so I see my children grow up, and some things we probably never talked about because everybody knew it. And I discover my children don't know that, and their peers don't know that. But there's something, I think, about pastoral care and about shaping and forming people to give the repetition. And so Paul says in chapter 2, verse 9, you remember our labor and toil. Chapter 2, verse 11, as you know. When he sends Timothy, and Timothy had told him that there's going to be some suffering. And in chapter 3, verse 4, Paul says, you know that we were destined for this. When he gets to the sexual ethics, actually, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2 is the beginning of the part about his the formation. Chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, we ask you and we appeal to you in the Lord, just as you have received from us how to walk and to behave or to please God, as you are walking, that you keep doing it. For you know what instructions we gave you through the Lord. So you know what instructions we have given you. So keep doing what you're doing because I taught you. Chapter 4, verse 6, he's talking about sexual ethics. And he tells them how to honor marriage. And then he says in 4:6, as we told you. So what do you do after conversion? You take them to school. And the Christian faith is a taught religion. You take them to school, you drill them, you repeat certain things. And that's what Paul says. Chapter 5, verse 2. For you know very well that the Lord comes like a thief in the night. Repetition. Originality, I think, is overrated, because the shaping and the forming of people requires some kind of repetition. So, having said all of that, we see in chapters 4 and 5 what we would call catechesis. That's kind of a form. That's not one of our words, but it's a good word. It just means instruction or teaching. And so there is catechesis for new converts. You know, in antiquity, in the ancient church, you had to be schooled before you were baptized. The catechesis. Paul engages in catechesis after they're baptized, before also, but after they're baptized, there's catechesis. And the catechesis is the instructions that he gives in chapters 4 and 5. So I already told you, he says, about taking a spouse or literally a vessel in holiness and honor. I already told you that. Don't act like the Gentiles. But this is what holiness is all about. Twice in that same paragraph, he talks about holiness, sanctification. It's not just a word, sanctification. It's something that he illustrates and defines by talking about their sexual ethics. New converts coming in, they don't know this, but it's repeated and repeated. I think of the church I grew up in, a church of 160 or so people, and as a teenager, how I resented all the repetition, especially of behavior and how we were supposed to behave. And I have much more appreciation for it now, that something sink in if you say it enough. And I think that this is what Paul is doing. So this is the mark of a great church, a church that behaves the way Paul instructed. So he talks about sexual ethics. The next one, 4:9 through 12, is, I don't need to tell you this, but practice Philadelphia, brotherly love. Now, to the best of my knowledge, in the ancient world, the word brotherly love, Philadelphia, was only used for real siblings. I don't know a record of this being used metaphorically. Wonderful story of the Maccabees as they're revolting against their oppressors, and they practice Philadelphia toward each other. They are real siblings. And one of the ancient essayists, Plutarch, writes on brotherly love, and all that he says about real siblings, this is what Paul is saying. So we have the sexual ethics, we have brotherly love, and then the part about the second coming, that takes up a major part. But you may notice the part about the second coming is not an academic exercise. The last line in 4:18 is, comfort one another with these words. The focus is not when and how he comes, but that he will come. Comfort one another with these words. Chapter 5, verse 11, the Lord is going to come like a thief in the night. The last line, build one another up. The one another passages, that's all the language of family. So we come to think about what is the mark of a great church. And I think it is interesting that the prayer that I started out with in the previous presentation, that you love one another more and more, you'll notice that that's the prayer. You'll notice that in chapter 1, what's his thanksgiving? Your labor of love. It's not a feeling. It's not just saying nice things. It's acting like a family. Your labor of love. What do families? Families love each other. This is family language. Your steadfastness of hope. It's a culture that often is hopeless, but you have the steadfastness of hope. That's what is the mark of the great church. So I see the kind of sequence. He prays for it in 3:11 and 12. He instructs them in 4:9 through 12 about Philadelphia, brotherly love, love one another. And then at the beginning of the letter, what's he thankful for? He is thankful for their faith, their hope, and their love. So Christian formation has to do with being the people that he calls sanctified. At the end of the letter, may God sanctify y'all wholly. And Christian formation is to experience that. And one other item I think I have to mention. Christian formation, the line in 3:2 and 3, I told you that you would be experiencing these sufferings. You'll suffer them together. Almost every letter of Paul talks about Christians sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Christ suffered, and formation means self-denial and sharing in the suffering of Christ. Paul preached with great distress, with great conflict. They received the word with conflict. It wasn't easy being a Christian. Many trials. But nevertheless, it was not easy. But at the end of the road, with the self-denial, they become what Paul wants them to be at the second coming of Christ. And to me, that's Christian formation. Well, we always have to translate that into our own time. And I think I fought a losing battle most of my career because people do think of the church as a voluntary association of individuals. And it's a consumer choice. You can come and you can go. It's a consumer choice. And the idea of sharing burdens together as a family, whatever the circumstances are, that is so hard to get through to an individualistic society. But to me, that's the task of the task of preaching and teaching, is to give your individuals a sense of collective identity. Collective identity. We're not just individuals choosing each other the way we would choose a social club. Christ brought us together, and we're together, whatever happens, because we will be in the process of becoming the people he wants us to be. I come back to one of my favorite passages. The God who began a good work in y'all will bring it to completion. Philippians 1:6. And that's where I think we are. There are instructions for us, but ultimately it's God. God is at work among you, not in you, but among you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And I think that's the challenge that we face as a church. And I'm not as concerned. Churches are diminishing in size. I'm less concerned about that than the identity of people being shaped and formed wherever they are and regardless of what the numbers are. And I hope that is something that we can spread and tell our churches about, and our churches can be shaped and formed by the crucified Christ. And I'll stop there and take any questions. Yes?
I just want to add a comment. I think that it is interesting that Paul would use family language in this letter, especially since we, the members, are supposed to be acting as a family anyway. So
Supposed to be what?
acting as a family.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I find the word love is such an empty word in our vocabulary, but all of that's always heads the list of what Paul wants his people to do. But he's thinking not as an emotion, but he's thinking you are going to be the social safety net for each other. There was no social safety net, no social security or anything like that. That's what families did. You will be the social safety net for each other. And that's what love meant in that context.
We have to be reminded of that. We have to be reminded of that in time.
Yeah. It may be my old age that I think repetition is a really good thing. Yes.
On that note, I know the lectures today were obviously about 1 Thessalonians, but I'm curious what the implications for 2 Thessalonians might be. I know I've heard at times 2 Thessalonians described as like Paul's having to go back and do things that you sort of imagine him getting frustrated. It's like I'm having to talk about the man of lawlessness now and these things that I already, we talked all the eschatological stuff already, but I'm wondering if this is really part of, Paul's ministry in Thessalonica is much longer, much more involved, that what seems like maybe unnecessary repetition to us is part of this process of spiritual formation that you've been describing today. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to where this might be headed in that second letter.
Well, one of the things I learned in the intro to New Testament is that you don't know the sequence of those two letters. You don't know which one came first. But if you read through 2 Thessalonians, it's largely repetition of the kinds of moral instructions that he gives. So I don't see any tension. There's tension in the depiction of the second coming and how it's going to happen. There's tension in that. But as far as the formation aspect, he gives a lot of the same advice, like work with your hands and things like that. He gives that same advice. Love each other. That's his the advice that he gives. Yes, Jeremy. I'm afraid of Jeremy asking a question.
Outstanding. It was a tremendous, wonderful experience. One of the things that I really enjoyed too, that was kind of a teaser, was you kind of talked a little bit about criteria that we use for growing churches, and in a sort of hit list fashion, would you be willing to share just one or two insights and a little more on that? Like for instance, pushing away from counting numbers, for instance, because you basically made a good observation. I've never thought about. I don't think there's a single time Paul says our numbers have gone up 20%. Could you say a little more about that?
Acts has some numbers, but Paul has no numbers. He's very happy with the Thessalonian church. Who knows how many people they had. Okay. Refreshing me with the question.
Just a little more about a word or two about the criteria. I like that.
Well, yeah, the problem, of course, is the numbers can be measured. And so it's very easy to say, well, our budget's 10% more than last year, or it went down, or whatever. That's all measurable stuff. Some of you probably are involved in institutional effectiveness here. How do you measure some things? Everything has to be quantified. But I think you have to give your church a sense of getting beyond the numbers. You know, I know it's hard to do. How many times I've been into a church that had seats 1,000 and there are 100 there. That's discouraging. That may be a good church, but that's really a discouraging fact to see all the empty seats. There may be an aging church where all the kids have moved away, an inner city church, this kind of thing. Those are good churches. And it's hard in your bones. You just really have to transform your way of thinking to think there's nobody here under 70, but they're doing good things. So you just have to, the teacher, and I guess the preacher has to begin thinking that way, and it's hard because he's being measured by those numbers. But that is the challenge. Yeah. Ed?
You mentioned, again, back to the family aspect, that Paul is trying to encourage his readers to imagine themselves in these terms, and he uses the term brother quite a bit in 1 Thessalonians and, of course, in all of his letters. Is that common for outside of a Christian context in the first century? Was like in other ecclesiae or other social groups, did they use family language in metaphorical ways?
I'm not an expert on that, whether they did or not. I can imagine if some of the ecclesia like to work trade deals. I can imagine they could say that. The only difference, of course, is they just had men.
Yeah.
They didn't have the spouses and the children and all that. But I can imagine that they used brother language. They didn't have to take over the social safety net because they still had families. See, the love for Paul means social safety net because you don't have a family to love you, to take care of you when you're aging or sick or whatever. So spiritual formation was getting a sense that we and that we're responsible for each other. I know a lot of churches who do it pretty well. For those who are in need, I think ours does pretty well. But that's what love and that's what family means. Families like love is an overused and meaningless word, actually. The corporation, they say the family. My son works for Target. I'm sure they say the Target family or something like that. But that's meaningless stuff. Somebody gets fired, do you care? I mean, they don't take care of each other. But family is the social safety net that they lost when they became Christians.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So you were talking about his work as like his knowledge of rhetoric.
Uh-huh.
And I've kind of dipped my pinky into that, but you know, it's obvious maybe like Cicero or Quintilian may have been involved with his knowledge. Do you know who he may have been exposed to in Tarsus? Like what kind of literature he may have actually been exposed to, or maybe somebody who does?
I think Paul is a rhetorician when he wants to be.
Right.
So he's not always. But that was the sport of antiquity. They didn't have Super Bowl. They went to hear orators. So what happens if you hear them enough, you hear good ones? Well, you kind of know what a good one sounds like. And you know what's persuasive and how to build your case. And, you know, there are some of the greatest orators who are not all that literate in this country because they've heard good speakers and they've kind of gotten the rhythm of it. So all you have to do is kind of listen to those who can do it well, and it makes an impact on you. I don't think Paul is prior to Quintilian, and he other people had, and he's listened to those people. Am I right, Jeremy? Yeah. Yes.
Yes, as an elder in the church, kind of just going back to what Jeremy was asking, is how do y'all see indicators of that spiritual formation in your own church?
One thing we do is, I guess, celebrate good deeds, and that puts in front of people. Use your, we have a daily news blast that goes out. Celebrate good deeds. There's some great things that have happened, and we want people to know about it because they want to join in. And you do have to communicate to, I think, the preacher. Preacher's always going to sound defensive if he's going to say numbers don't count. And they'll say, oh, yeah, that sounds pretty defensive to me. But those who have the pulpit or those who have the mic are the ones to try to fashion another way of seeing things, that we are in the business of transforming people and caring for people within our community. We try to do that. Okay? No more questions.